Hello all, and welcome back to the Potted Plant Politics YouTube channel. Now, before I start this video, I would just like to say I am recording this on the 6th of the 7th, 2026 at approximately 11 a.m. I'm only saying this because the topic I'm about to discuss today is still ongoing and could change at any given second. With that being said, today I would like to discuss the implications of Andy Burnham's meteoric rise after 10 years away from Parliament, of course. He was the Mayor of Greater Manchester. He is now the MP for Makerfield. And if everybody's supposed to be believed, future Prime Minister of Great Britain. But what does this mean? What would he like to do? And what are the economic implications of a Andy Burnham premiership? So, if Andy Burnham does come to power, this will be another unelected prime minister. This is constitutionally okay, as Labour still have a majority, so they are allowed to elect a new leader, and that new leader would naturally become prime minister. But politically, this is a bit of a minefield, and already Nigel Farage and his band of merry men, so-called Reform, have already called out this lack of voting as another Westminster stitch-up and have called for a general election. This sort of thing does happen a lot in the UK. We had a direct passover between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown in the past. We also had it rather recently with Liz Truss and Richie Sunak. This is because the Conservatives at the time and Labour back then had a significant majority as they do now, so they were allowed to elect the new Prime Minister essentially without a vote, because as voters we select the MPs, not the leader of the party. The leader of the party is decided by those sitting in Parliament representing their party. The scary thing is here, Reform do have grounds for a rather legitimate argument in this case. Because, I mean, we've now had 6 prime ministers within 7 years. So, yes, it is quite a legitimate concern that needs addressing, and hopefully Andy Burnham will be able to stay in power for more than a year or or at least until, I believe, late 2027 is the next general election. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it is. The concern for me would be if Andy Burnham was to call a general election because he wants a new mandate, that Reform are polling pretty well at the moment, so they could legitimately take power. So, are there reasonable grounds for a general election? Yes. Should there be a general election? Now, that's a bit more of a tougher question, but I would say probably yes. If Andy Burnham really wants to prove himself to the general public and get a new mandate in, new promises, he probably should. Will Andy Burnham call a general election? I don't think so. Because the concern would be, for me and the Labour Party personally, that those idiots at Reform would win and everything would go to shit, basically. So I wouldn't call one in this current political climate, but should there be one? Probably yes. And it's very reasonable, the argument for one. But I'd be very concerned if I was the Labour Party at the moment, and I would try and ride it out based on the uh, based on the constitutional rights of the Labour Party. But moving away from the will they, won't they, in terms of a general election, what would Andy Burnham actually do as Prime Minister of Great Britain? One of the biggest talking points and potential policies that Andy Burnham will try to implement is devolution. Now, a lot of people, they discuss this in the news and all over the place, but what does devolution actually mean? So, at the moment, the way the political system works is every MP, whether you're from Cardiff, Swansea, Newport, Scunthorpe, Birmingham, every MP gets in their cars or their trains and they travel up to Westminster, big posh building, and they vote on things that they might want to change there. But often you see these centralized issues, they're exactly what I just said. Centralized issues. The big issues, not local grounded issues. What devolution will do is it will take some of Westminster's power away and give it to local authorities. They will, in a sense, divulge power to local authorities. So your MP in Scunthorpe can make those local decisions to benefit its local constituents easier than it could before. In my personal opinion, this is a very good policy, and I would be fully in support of this policy myself. The counter argument to this is, well, it could see disparities in counties, and I would call that counter argument complete bullshit, to be honest with you, because it is clear that there is already major disparities between certain counties in the north and certain counties in the south. I mean, just compare, for example, I went to uni in Bath. Bath looks really nice, lovely, no potholes anywhere. Compare that to somewhere like Wolverhampton, for example, where there's potholes everywhere, graffiti, all of it. So I'd argue that there is already major disparities in terms of budgets and spending in these areas anyway, and devolution can only serve to try and shrink the so-called North and South divide rather than make it worse. Another thing that Andy Burnham isn't a fan of, that I once again agree with this man on, is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism. Forgive me, I can't pronounce it properly. But even though it sounds like a big word, all it means is privatization. So basically, giving companies more control. Think railways and gas and water. Things that are already in private hands becoming perhaps more private. Like, there's also a concern with healthcare there. It also means deregulation. So we'd have less control as a government and as a public. Now, the benefits of neoliberalism are that it would bring potentially more money in, more business, more jobs. But the problem is with that is it can lead to private shareholder profits increasing over the public interest. So basically the idea is, once again, complete bullshit nonsense. Regulation is needed in this country to stop the big tech billionaires from basically taking over the entire world. Because if there was more free markets and more deregulation, there would be no need for them to keep up with employment standards and things like that. And our gas and our water could become 10 times more expensive. So could our already extortionate, if you ask me, train ticket prices. I have a rail card, though, so yeah. But then again, I had to pay for that rail card, even though I'm a wheelchair user. And in my opinion, I should be able to use my bus pass to get the same third off. But that's a story for a different time. So, what's the opposite of neoliberalism? Neoliberalism. Nationalisation. Nationalisation. It's typically a good thing, I would argue. It a lot of economists typically suggest that it would make things cheaper, and yes, sometimes it does, and it can. I lost my train of thought. And yes, it can sometimes make things cheaper, but not always. And the main benefit of nationalisation for me is it's more in the public interest. Meaning that if possible, it will benefit the public more than neoliberalism will, because it is public interest first over shareholder profit. This means if it is possible to make things cheaper, it will. If it is possible to upgrade the service to make it more efficient, it will. Because it has no obligation to shareholders. It basically can reinvest everything into making the public service more efficient and sometimes cheaper. Now, there is a slight downside to nationalisation. The reason why things are sometimes privatised is because, well, sometimes you see the government don't have the resources to allocate to that specific area, meaning in terms of the labour market. What that means is the government will sometimes outsource to private contractors for their services because it is more efficient for them to run it and for the government to allocate resources elsewhere. That is why privatization exists in the first place, because it is sometimes more efficient to privatize things. But generally, privatize- privatization is more favorable to shareholders, and nationalization is typically more favorable to the public interest. Now, if you've got this far in the video, you're probably thinking of, do you want to marry this man? You must love him so much. And yes, I will admit, Andy Burnham has some fantastic policies, or some, or at least a fantastic wish list. But here's where I disagree with him just a slight bit. Now we reach the idea of corporate tax. Small businesses and the high street. So I was watching LBC the other day, and on it they were looking at one of Auntie Burnham's interviews, where he said he would like to up corporate taxes on the big conglomerates in order to completely write off corporate taxes for smaller local businesses on the high street. And now here's the thing, from an ideological point of view, I don't actually disagree with that idea. In fact, I think it's a lovely idea in premise. The problem is, you don't need to think about it too hard to see that it's not gonna work. Well, at least not in my opinion. I'd love to be proven wrong, however. The reason why I disagree with it is in increasing corporate taxes on the big conglomerates might encourage them to leave. And yes, and Andrew Marr on LBC did say, well, we don't have the taxes. We don't have the big data centers. So what would encourage these big corporate giants to stay in this country if we did increase taxes? And do you know what he said? The UK consumer market. We do have the consumers who love consuming technology and products all the time, and we are one of the biggest consumer markets, which we are. I'll give Andrew that, but I do think you definitely don't need to overstate our pull when it comes to our consumer market, because whilst we are one of the biggest, there are also several bigger again consumer markets, like Asia and the Middle East and America, for example. Those are all consumer markets that are bigger than ours. So, what I'm trying to say is, companies do have choices. They can move to areas where there are less taxes, less building regulations, and less restrictions. And if these big conglomerates leave, they will take thousands of jobs with them to other countries, as well as the taxes they're already paying. And as for the high street, I mean, come on, Andy. You were doing so well, and then you had to say the high street is dead, but don't worry, guys, we can revive it. How? How, Andy? Oh, maybe by reducing their taxes. Oh, yeah, making it cheaper for them. You don't understand, Andy. Oh, poor Andy. The problem is not taxes. Yes, taxes on physical brick and mortar stores are high, especially in the big city centres. But the problem is mostly demand. With the rise of e-commerce, the demand for the physical high street has been demolished almost. Don't get me wrong, I still love going to a CEX, but the people who are nostalgic for the high street are not are now older. They're in their 40s and 50s. And if we think about the future for just 1 second, I'm 22, right? And I personally love the convenience of going on Amazon and buying whatever I want and having it turn up the next day. I sometimes cannot be asked to go into a physical store. That being said, in an ideal world, would I love to see the return of Virgin Media Megastores, Woolworths, things like that? The return of a thriving high street? Yes, because it's a nice atmosphere. But you have to think most people my age want convenience. They want products on demand. And things like e-commerce and Amazon and shipping and online shopping can offer that, where brick and mortar stores and the high street simply can't. So, would I like to see corporate taxes increase in an ideal world? Yes, absolutely, because they don't pay enough. But practically, could you implement the policy? No, I wouldn't say completely no, because you could, but would the risk be worth the reward? I don't think so, Andy. Sorry. I think I'm going to have to label this one Fairytale Economics, because the idea of the high street being revived and higher corporate taxes is a brilliant, lovely idea, but the practical implications and the potentially economic downturns are not worth the reward in any circumstance. And there's also questions being asked of whether Andy Burnham's local gritty style of politics can translate well to the international stage, because it's all well and good dealing with issues surrounding Greater Manchester, but how is that going to translate to dealing with Trump G7 summits, NATO summits. There are wars going on in the Middle East, and there's Russia and Ukraine. There's also a wild orange man with a wig on the loose. You don't know what he's gonna do. Donald Trump changing it. Donald Trump changing his mind every 2 seconds. Could Andy Burnham realistically deal with that? Who knows? I was watching the Rest is Politics podcast the other day, and they theorised that maybe Keir Starmer stays on as far as Foreign Secretary to help Andy Burnham, where he is supposedly weak the most. So the question is, can Andy Burnham potentially be a great Prime Minister? Yes. He has good policies like devolution, and he's not a fan of neoliberalism, and he's more of a fan of nationalism, which definitely gets my vote, because it seems like he's got the public interests at heart and not just the interests of the South, but also being from Manchester himself. He's obviously got the interests of the whole country in mind as well, so he could be very good. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Bye all!